Morant with a running start. Elevate! Dunks! Oh my goodness! Tie game in overtime. Gasol will turn. His heat is gone! Memphis on top. 7-10 remaining. Conley now with three. Count it! A 15-point lead for Memphis. And Blake Griffin gets into it on the floor with Randolph. Hard to tell if there are any punches being thrown under there, but Griffin took acceptance. Adams going long. Morant! He hit it! John Morant, insanity!
You gotta be kidding me.
Welcome to Grits and Grinds, a Memphis Grizzlies podcast. My name is Keith Parrish. The Grizzlies had a rough weekend in the Bay. They lost back-to-back games. They lost on the second night of a back-to-back for the first time all year. They fell to the Kings and the Warriors. They wrapped up their 5-game Western Conference road trip, not exactly how they wanted. So on today's episode, I'm going to talk about both of those games. I'm also going to talk about this Jimmy Butler trade situation that somehow the Grizzlies got themselves roped into. Now, I got to let you know kind of how the sausage is made over here at Grits and Grinds. As most of you know, I record these shows. They take me a little bit of time to get ready to record. Once I start recording, it takes me half hour, 40 minutes. Then when I'm done, I go through and edit the audio. It's really, really quick. The video stuff I put on YouTube takes a little bit longer. So what happens sometimes is news breaks before the show gets done. Now, in this situation, Jimmy Butler's been suspended by the Heat. They're maybe going to trade him somewhere. My fear is I spend a lot of time talking about it, and then he ends up getting traded somewhere else. By the way, I do not think he's getting traded to the Grizzlies. That's also a little bit of a behind-the-scenes action. When this rumor first broke, I didn't pay any attention to it whatsoever because it didn't make any sense for the Grizzlies in my mind. Not saying Jimmy Butler wouldn't make the team better, but I didn't see how or why the Grizzlies would make this offer. So anyways, I have my phone set up with notifications on. Perhaps Jimmy Butler gets traded to somebody, gets traded to the Warriors while I'm talking. If that's the case, great. I'll just talk about the Grizzlies. This is fine. But today's episode, I'm going to talk about the loss to the Kings. I'm going to talk about the loss to the Warriors. I will talk about the Jimmy Butler situation, why, in my opinion, I find it unlikely this is what the Grizzlies would choose to do. And also maybe we'll get into some other stuff. But before we get into all of that, I do need to tell you, especially local listeners, I got to tell the local listeners anywhere near Nashville, Tennessee, we're having our first watch party of 2025. It's this Thursday. It's the Dillon Brooks game. Grizzlies Rockets this Thursday night, January 9th. Come on down to Noble's Beer Hall. It's going to be cold, but it's not supposed to be icy or snowy or rainy. Just going to be cold. We can beat that. We will watch the Grizzlies take on the Rockets. Thursday night, 7 p.m., Noble's Beer Hall in East Nashville. We'll be giving away a bunch of Grizzlies prizes. Make sure you show up. All right, let's start with the basketball games. The Grizzlies lost to the Kings 138-133. The Kings made 21 three-pointers. That's a lot. Domantas Sabonis hit 3. DeMar DeRozan hit 4. Trey Lyles was 4 for 4 from the three-point line. It's hard to win when the Sacramento Kings make 21 three-pointers. Despite that, it was a pretty close game. This was an incredibly, for me, entertaining and fun game. Of course, there's the sting of defeat, but this game was wild. High scoring, lots of highlights, lots of fun stuff from the Grizzlies' perspective. You had Jaylen Wells returning to Sacramento, where he went to high school, having a career high, scored 30 points, made 8 out of 9 three-pointers. Spectacular game. But you end up losing. You don't feel good about losing. Not ideal. Then, second out of the back-to-back, you play the Warriors. They don't have Steph Curry. You lose anyway. And of course, the Grizzlies are still shorthanded. We beat the Suns, so we got pretty excited about our shorthanded, perhaps our capabilities. And both of these games, they were relatively close. The Grizzlies hung around, had their opportunities perhaps to win the game. But where the Kings made 21 three-pointers, the Warriors made 23 three-pointers in a game where Steph Curry did not play. That's 44 three-pointers allowed in the span of 26 hours or so. Now, the Grizzlies hung in with the Warriors based on second chance scoring. The Grizzlies had 23 second chance points to the Warriors 2. But when you lose the three-point battle by 42 points, not a lot you can really do. So you lose a disappointing game to the Warriors. You lose a disappointing game to the Kings. You end this 5-game Western Conference road trip 2-3. None of that's great. Now, here are some actually even more concerning numbers. Perhaps. These are just facts. So do with them what you will. But I do think they paint the picture of a squad that perhaps could use someone like Jimmy Butler, could use a little bit more firepower. Now, of course, Ja Morant's not healthy and is not playing. Meanwhile, you have Marcus Smart, who, frankly, I don't feel like you can depend on. But right now for this season, after losing these back-to-back games to the Kings and the Warriors, you are 10-10 against the Western Conference. That is the 12th worst conference record in the West. The only teams with a worse record than the Grizzlies in the Western Conference against the Western Conference is the Trailblazers, the Jazz, and the Pelicans. Well, that's not great. Meanwhile, the Grizzlies have played the least number of games against the West in the entire conference. So that part's not super good. Next, you look at the quality of opponent. The Grizzlies haven't played the Spurs or Timberwolves yet. Two pretty good teams. Both of those teams will be played in the next week or next 2 weeks. But among the rest of the teams that are 500 or better in the Western Conference, currently the Grizzlies are 3-9 against Western Conference teams that are 500 or better. They're 1-5 without Ja Morant. With Ja Morant, they're 2-4. Those games are, you got destroyed by the Thunder, no Ja Morant. You got blown out by the Rockets early in the year. Fully healthy squad, essentially, for the Grizzlies in that game. You split with the Nuggets. You didn't have Ja Morant in either one of those games. The Nuggets didn't have Jokic in either one of those games. So we can throw that out, basically. You lost to the Mavericks in a game that was a Grizzlies watch party in Nashville, where you blew a big lead in the fourth quarter. Very disappointing game. Ja Morant did play in that one. You lost to the Clippers, of course, very recently. You're now 1-2 against the Warriors. Ja Morant missed both defeats. He was there the time we blew the Warriors out by 1 million. And that, again, adds up to 3-9 against the Western Conference teams that are 500 or better. All of that, I think we could fairly say, a little bit concerning. Now, of course, there's different context going into a lot of these games. The players who are out for each squad, especially the Grizzlies, the scheduling aspect. So it's not a blanket statement saying that the Grizzlies are in trouble because they've struggled against the West so far. It's just something to keep an eye on and say, okay, maybe we're not as good as we hoped we were when we had that 20-game span with a historic point differential. The Grizzlies have crushed the East, 13-3 against the East, been middling against the West. They've crushed terrible opponents, middling to bad against good opponents. A little more about specifics for some of maybe the random stats of the last two games. I thought these were all notable stats that were interesting to me. Now, I talked last episode about Jaylen Wells and his splits in wins versus losses. He was shooting just 20% from the three-point line in losses. The Grizzlies were 14-0 going into that Kings game when Jaylen Wells made at least a third of his three-point attempts. Any game where Jaylen Wells made 33% or better of his threes, the Grizzlies won. Well, he had a career-high 8 made threes on 9 attempts. That's 89%. Of course, the streak snapped. The Grizzlies lost their first game when Jaylen Wells had a good three-point shooting night. There were also some other kind of notable stats that made this loss to the Kings on Friday stand out as an aberration. Before this game, they were 15-1 this season when making at least 15 three-pointers. They made 17 threes against the Kings. They shot a good percentage from three because of Jaylen Wells mainly. They had been 16-2 on the season when they racked up 30 or more assists. They had 31. They had been 19-3 when Brandon Clark played 15 or more minutes. He played 23 minutes against the Kings. He started. Edey did play. He returned from the concussion absence. Turned out, by the way, Zach Edey did not have a concussion. He apparently just had concussion-like symptoms, and then they determined, actually, no concussion here. You're good to go. So Edey came off the bench on Friday. He started against the Warriors on Saturday. But they still lost. They'd been 19-3 when Brandon Clark played at least 15 minutes, and he played 23. Now look at the all-time history of the Grizzlies. Coming into this game, for regulation games, those that don't go into overtime, the Grizzlies had been 53-1 in franchise history when they scored at least 130 points. They score 133 and they lose. Not ideal. But I didn't get too broken up over the Kings game. I thought it was entertaining. I thought it was fun. I thought the team played mostly well. Of course, they gave up a ton of points. But I scratched most of that up, or I chalk most of that up to the fact that the Kings were just making three-pointers. And with the pace the Grizzlies play, they're going to give up a lot of points. The first half score, it was similar to that Pelicans game. It was like 78-73 or something around that. I lost my page where I had that open. But the Grizzlies lose to the Kings. One notable stat from this game, and maybe it's unfair to pick on it, but the Grizzlies outscored the Kings in this game by 16 when Scottie Pippen Jr. wasn't on the court. Scottie Pippen Jr. was a team worst, minus 24. Single game plus minus, not that useful of a stat. Very misleading at times. Of course, Scottie Pippen Jr. gets the start with no Ja Morant. He's having to play the Kings' best lineups. But one notable stat, I think, is the season-long numbers with Scottie Pippen Jr. based on when he's on the court and when he's not on the court. This year, when Scottie Pippen Jr. is not on the court, we're talking 1,800 possessions. The Grizzlies have a plus 16.4 net rating when Scottie Pippen Jr. is off the court. That is a huge number, first of all, of course. It's a large sample size. And I don't know if there's other teams out there where you could take away one player and their team-wide plus-minus goes to plus 16. I mean, you think maybe the Thunder or the Celtics, these other teams with massive positive point differentials, the Cavaliers maybe. It's like whenever, I don't know, Max Strus isn't on the court, perhaps the Cavs have a huge plus-minus. But that's a massive number. And then looking further into it, I think this is very interesting. This is something I mentioned on the last episode. A listener pointed this out to me. Now I've tracked it after 2 more games where the Scottie Pippen lineups did not go that well. For the season right now, when Scottie Pippen is off the court and also Ja Morant is off the court, the Grizzlies have a plus 23.1 net rating. Again, a very big, eye-popping number. No point guard lineups have been crushing for the Grizzlies. Now, Adam Pike, otherwise known as Grizzlies Film on social media, he does highlight there is some unsustainably bad opponent three-point shooting, propping those numbers up. Now, that doesn't explain that entire number away. That just kind of makes it so gaudy. If the opponent was shooting a little bit better than 29% from three, the plus-minus wouldn't be that wild. But that's a interesting number for the Grizzlies. That right now, one, you're killing teams when Scottie Pippen Jr. is not on the court for the whole year, and then non-point guard lineups continue crushing. A couple more thoughts for the Kings game, or a couple more observations / interesting things that happened. Jaren Jackson Jr. had 28 points. He had 6 rebounds. He had 5 assists. He also fouled out, which is not that notable. But it is notable because he had 0 fouls through the first 3 quarters. He fouled out, picking up all 6 fouls in the fourth quarter. Also, none of the fouls were intentional. So, a lot of frustration right there. Also, how about Luke Kennard's game against the Kings? Luke Kennard flirted with a triple-double. 11 points, 9 assists, a season high, 8 rebounds for Luke. Unfortunately, he played so well, he couldn't play the second night of a back-to-back. This is rather typical for Luke Kennard. He put together a few nice games in a row, has to miss a game. Maybe it was just a planned rest because of the back-to-back game. They did not present it as such on the injury report, but this has been the story of the Grizzlies. Not just Luke, but Ja and Marcus, even John Conchar. They play a few games and then they're out and they miss games. Conchar did not play in either game over the weekend after amassing double-digit rebounds in back-to-back games while the front court was very depleted. Conchar misses both of these games. Now, some people want to make some kind of thoughts that he's being held out because he's in trade discussions. Maybe John Conchar's the linchpin of a Jimmy Butler trade. But anyways, you lose a high-scoring shootout to the Kings, and then second night of a back-to-back, you lose to the Warriors. It was a low-scoring affair early. The first quarter was very in the mud, I would say, very grit and grindy. Jake LaRavia made a big impact in the first quarter. He ended up hitting a half-court shot to finish the first quarter. Jake had a huge game in this one. Jake actually finished with a career-high 10 assists off the bench, had 17 points, 10 assists, and 4 rebounds. But like I said earlier, story of this game is three-point shooting. Grizzlies only made 9 3-pointers. Jaylen Wells, following up that 8-for-9 game on the road, missed all 5 of his 3-point attempts, and the Warriors ended up making 23 3-pointers. Now, despite that, the Grizzlies were close for most of the game. This was essentially a single-digit margin for the entire game. The Grizzlies briefly took the lead in the second quarter. They got within 1 point in the fourth quarter, but maybe they ran out of gas. They could not get over the hump and win the game. This is despite Jaren having 23 points and 9 rebounds, blocking a shot and getting 2 steals. This is despite Desmond Bane racking up 10 assists, also having 22 points. Scottie Pippen Jr. made 3 out of 4 3-pointers. So did Jay Huff. Jay Huff with a big impact against the Warriors. 9 points, 3 made threes, 3 blocks. Brandon Clark, I felt like had a nice game. Played 26 minutes, 10 points, 6 rebounds. Now the Grizzlies have lost consecutive games when Brandon Clark plays 15 or more minutes. Edey did not have the biggest game, but Edey, I felt like, provided a boost for the Grizzlies just by being a handful on the glass at all times. The Grizzlies keep having preposterous offensive rebounding numbers. The second chance scoring, Edey contributed in a big way to that. Also, he keeps getting into it with Draymond Green. I feel like that's advantage Grizzlies. I mean, maybe the refs were a little bit too tight on Draymond, which is a wild thing for me to say. Someone who has a lot of pent-up animosity towards Draymond Green as a basketball fan. But, like, Draymond got a technical for yelling boom after a made 3-pointer. Perhaps he looked at the referee when he yelled boom. I don't know. Draymond did rightfully get a flagrant foul in this game by hitting Edey. But, like, Edey got away with the push beforehand. I mean, I'm all for Edey getting away with pushes and shoves. I love it. But it was funny when the referees had to review this play for the flagrant and just watch that, like, oh yeah, we badly missed this call. But Edey and Draymond already, just 3 games into Zach Edey's career against the Warriors, have amassed a pretty good history. By the way, as I wrap up these basketball games and transition into Jimmy Butler trade rumors, a notable stat, so the Grizzlies gave up at least 120 points and 20 made threes in back-to-back games. Of course, the Grizzlies are going to have a bad record when that happens. They are 0-4 this season when that occurs. And in franchise history all time, they are 0-20 Of course, at some point they're going to win. Those numbers used to be huge outliers in the history of basketball. Now they are much more common, specifically the way the Grizzlies play this year. They're going to have games where they actually win when they allow their opponent to make 20 or more threes and also score 120 points. All right, now let's take a quick break. And Jimmy Butler still hasn't been traded. So let's get into this talk about Jimmy Butler and maybe the Grizzlies being interested in trading for him. As of noon Central, January 6th, Jimmy Butler is still on the Miami Heat. And I don't exactly know how this rumor got started with the Grizzlies perhaps being interested in Jimmy Butler. There are a lot of players where I feel like there are personal relationships between the Grizzlies stars and those players. And you're like, oh, I could see where something has started here. Like Desmond Bane hanging out with Mikal Bridges. Even John Conchar and Kevin Durant talking for a long time after the game. Kevin Durant has talked positively about Ja Morant many times before. Jaren Jackson Jr. is a very social NBA player, it seems like, and frequently will be talking with other players. You'll see him hanging out on social media. I've never seen any pictures of Jimmy Butler hanging out with any Grizzlies players. So as best I understand it, people started maybe suggesting it. I don't know if this was just a random blog or Bleacher Report or Fansided or something. And then there was this betting market that was only available in Colorado. DraftKings in Colorado had the Grizzlies as like plus 400 to get Jimmy Butler, which is like relatively good odds for this situation. And then apparently it was off the board. You couldn't even bet on the Grizzlies to go or the Grizzlies to acquire Jimmy Butler. It seems like that's the entire reason why this became a big story. Now, like I said, I've been ignoring it because I didn't feel like it made that much sense. Now, I do think when you look at the fact that the Grizzlies have struggled against good teams this year, that Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr. are in their prime, it makes sense to go out and get a difference maker. I am very much in favor of going out and getting a difference maker. My belief that this probably is not going to happen for the Grizzlies has to do with the fact that, one, matching the salary, again, is the issue. You're not trading Desmond Bane for Jimmy Butler. To match the salary to make it a legal trade, you'd have to include Brandon Clark, Marcus Smart, and Luke Kennard, and something else, probably John Conchar. Now we're talking about making a 4-for-1 trade. 4 players going out, 1 player coming in. Let's say the Heat include a minimum salary guy. Make it a 4-for-2 trade. You get him back like a Josh Richardson or Alec Burks or something. Even in that situation, that takes the Grizzlies into the luxury tax. Also, it takes them from 15 standard contracts to 13, which is below the minimum number of contracts you have to have, so they have to add another player. All of these scenarios involve the Grizzlies going into the luxury tax. The Grizzlies are allowed to go into the luxury tax. But of course, it seems like they're very reticent to do so. I also don't know what the cost would be in future assets to even acquire Jimmy Butler. Those matching salaries I just said, that's not a worthwhile trade for the Heat. Marcus Smart, if healthy, sure, fits in Heat culture, could be a great player for them, but that's not a fair trade by any stretch of the imagination. So you have to include picks. Let's say that the Grizzlies were willing to go into the luxury tax because they want to chase a title this season. They think Jimmy Butler is the difference-making player. So what picks are we talking about? Like a first rounder and a second rounder? Let's say the Heat are done with Jimmy Butler and they're very comfortable just with having expiring salary. Marcus Smart is not expiring salary, but you're still lowering your overall financial burden for the next upcoming season. Maybe the Heat are like, okay, we'll take a first-round pick and a second-round pick and call it a day. That seems unlikely to me, but even if that is the case, is trading a future first-round pick for Jimmy Butler and those players mentioned, is that really worth it? Probably, yeah. If we're talking about like a somewhat protected first-round pick, that is probably worth it for the Grizzlies, even if Jimmy Butler opts out of his salary next year and just becomes a free agent. To me, I don't think it's a slam dunk to say that trading, like, let's say your 2026 first round pick, top 5 protected, trading that future asset for 30 or 40 games of Jimmy Butler, I don't know if that's worth it. I will entertain an argument that it is worth it because Jimmy Butler is the difference maker when healthy. But also, let's say, like we have been saying, theoretically, Robert Parra is willing to pay the luxury tax this season. They're willing to move on from those guys they're willing to attach draft capital to bring in Jimmy Butler. All that being said, I don't think Jimmy Butler's an ideal fit with Ja Morant. I actually think it's kind of a bad fit with Ja Morant. I have a hard time imagining the Grizzlies trading draft assets for a guy who doesn't shoot three-pointers. Now, we maybe got wrong on this line of thinking going into the draft, thinking, why would the team target Zach Edey? Everything we've heard about Tomas Isala's offense and Patrick St. Andrew's offense and Noah LaRoche's ideas, all of these things are saying all three-point shooting and ball handling. Why would you go with Zach Edey? Well, we were wrong there. They went with Zach Edey. It's worked out great. And you could say Jimmy Butler is enough of a difference maker on his own. He creates enough advantages that it doesn't matter that he's not a great three-point shooter. But I still think the fit is weird. I think the fit is weird with Jimmy Butler. And I think imagining if he'd opt out of the salary, the fit is weird to like do a rental. Also, this is not the same situation of like the Raptors getting a year of Kawhi Leonard, basically. I mean, Kawhi Leonard was in his prime. He was arguably the best player in the league when he was on the Raptors. Jimmy Butler is not. Also, I have issues personally with like taking this risk on an injury-prone guy like Jimmy Butler. But even beyond that, I think the salary situation makes it so incredibly unlikely. If Jimmy Butler opted into his salary going into next year, you're basically going to be a tax-paying team. To acquire him this year, you'd also have to be a tax-paying team. I don't see any way, if you hang on to Desmond Bane, I don't see any way you could acquire Jimmy Butler this season and fill out your roster to have the mandatory 14 players and not go into the tax. Also, I think it's important to remember a lot of the explanations for why the Grizzlies dodged the tax this offseason. Think about the financials of the team. The Diamond Sports Group bankruptcy cost the Grizzlies millions and billions of dollars. Their local television rights fees, we don't know the exact amount, but it went down probably by like $10 or $15 million. To then say, all right, your revenues for the team are $10 million less because of television this year, a thing that's totally out of your control. And then to also say Robert Parra is going to be willing to pay luxury tax. And then to also say, well, when you do that, you lose out on the luxury tax disbursement payments that go to all the other teams that don't pay luxury tax. We're talking about like a $30 to $40 to $50 million swing in actual revenue. Is Robert Parra willing to do that? Is any NBA owner willing to do that for half a season of Jimmy Butler? I would say no, which is why I haven't entertained this idea very much. I also think if that was something the team was going to be willing to do this season, if they saw, hey, during the year, there might be the opportunity to trade for a disgruntled superstar, and that's going to be the thing we need to take us over the top. If the team thought that was a option or something they were open to this season, I don't think they would have traded Zaire Williams' contract in the offseason. It would be much easier to match the salary of Jimmy Butler if you still had Zaire's contract on the books. You paid a second-round pick. Perhaps the hang-up in not acquiring Dorian Finney-Smith from the Nets is you were asking for a second-round pick back. We know as the Grizzlies, we value second-round picks because we can go draft a Jaylen Wells or a Gigi Jackson. Well, they gave away one of those valuable second-round picks to move off of Zaire Williams' salary, to bring back, what was that guy's name? Mamadi Diakite. Yeah, to bring back that guy just to cut salary. Remember, they stretched the contract. This is not about Zaire the player. I'm talking about Zaire the salary. It would be much easier to match salary in these trades if you still had Zaire Williams. If you still had kept Zaire Williams, you could still have Jay Huff on a two-way or Scottie Pippen Jr. You could have promoted one of those guys, probably Scottie, but like you could have your same team right now, minus, say, Colin Castleton or something. And you would have kept Zaire's contract. You could have still re-signed Luke. You could have gone into the luxury tax. Remember, you don't pay luxury tax until the year's over. You still maybe could have gotten under the tax if you needed to and left yourself the ability to match salary in a big trade like this. So I guess in summary of all that, as I keep checking my phone to make sure Jimmy Butler has not been traded yet, my summary of all that is, first of all, I don't think he's an ideal fit with the Grizzlies. Now, would I rather have Jimmy Butler than Jaylen Wells? As far as a starting lineup, closing lineup? Of course. The Grizzlies would be awesome with Jimmy Butler out there. Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Jimmy Butler with Edie and Ja. That's an amazing lineup. I think you have to ask yourself, is that lineup better than the Thunder? I don't think so. So if you're not going to make yourself a finals favorite, would you make the call to include future assets? Also, more than likely, and I haven't even mentioned it yet, if this trade happens, you're including something that you don't want to get rid of, I would guess. Like Gigi Jackson. Do you want to trade Gigi Jackson and a future first for maybe a half a season or a year and a half of Jimmy Butler? Now, if you did trade for Jimmy Butler, maybe you could work out an extension. Maybe you'd have an understanding he's going to opt out. You can sign him to a lower number going forward. Perhaps. All of it just falls under the, it seems unlikely. So I don't think the fit is perfect. Not ideal with what the Grizzlies are trying to do. Also, I think the cost, the financial cost for the team, the financial cost to pay luxury tax this year doesn't seem likely to me for that. Also, I don't know how you'd keep the team together. And again, even if you traded those guys, like, all right, Luke Kennard's gone, no big deal. Getting off Marcus Smart's salary for next year, maybe that's fine because Marcus Smart hasn't been able to stay healthy. Getting off John Konchar's salary, not a big deal. But even if Jimmy Butler walks away, it's not going to open up a ton of salary cap space next year. Because remember, we're still not going to be that far under the cap. It's not like you can sign somebody else for $50 million. No. If Jimmy Butler leaves, maybe you can work out a sign and trade and bring back in a high cost player, that situation. But it would require a lot of cap gymnastics, and it seems, again, I'm going to keep reusing the word, unlikely that the Grizzlies would get involved in it. Now, I'm not trying to stop your dreams of Jimmy Butler. And I'm not even trying to stop your dreams of a trade. Because here's what I will say. I'll end the show on this. If Jimmy Butler gets traded, I do hope the Grizzlies get involved under a couple of different scenarios. The most likely trade destination to me would be the Warriors. The Warriors have fallen off a cliff. Yes, they just beat the Grizzlies, but the Warriors are struggling. By the way, the Warriors got destroyed by the Kings on Sunday night. If the Warriors trade for Jimmy Butler, which makes sense to me, they seem to be very cognizant of the fact they got Steph and Draymond, maybe one more year. Steph's having trouble with his knees. One final swing, go get Jimmy Butler. If the Warriors trade for Jimmy Butler, the Grizzlies have to swoop in and get Andrew Wiggins. I'm pretty sure Andrew Wiggins would have to be involved in the matching salary. In that situation, the Warriors trade for Jimmy Butler, the Grizzlies have to turn Marcus Smart into Andrew Wiggins. I mean, I've been wanting the Grizzlies to trade for Andrew Wiggins for a year and a half. I thought it was a good buy low opportunity. Andrew Wiggins' once bloated salary is now a bargain. Andrew Wiggins is having a resurgent season like I thought he might. Much better positional fit than the Grizzlies than Marcus Smart is. I would definitely want the Grizzlies to be involved in that situation. Like right now, when I look at the roster, I'm not eager to move Brandon Clark. I am, frankly, eager to turn the salaries of Marcus Smart, Luke Kennard, and John Konchar into something that can help you more. Those salaries don't add up to Jimmy Butler. Those salaries do add up to Cam Johnson. They do add up to Andrew Wiggins. Those are the guys that I feel like are big needle movers, and they also don't feel like short-sighted moves. Those guys can stick with you. They're under contract for a little bit longer. You can dodge the tax next season if you want to and keep those guys. I don't see how you dodge the tax next season with Jimmy Butler. And also, again, it goes back to the fact that I don't think the Grizzlies, based on everything we've seen from them so far, one, are willing to go into the tax for this move. Also, would be willing to trade future assets. They're very good at drafting. And I don't know if this is the all-in move you make to a guy this old. When Ja Morant and Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. are all 26 years old and younger, I don't think Jimmy Butler at 35 is the guy you do it for. I think maybe you'd want to get a guy at least, early 30s, late 20s. That being said, also, if it was like Kevin Durant who's available, Kevin Durant's old, I'd do it for Kevin Durant, frankly. The Suns, by the way, going through it, trying out a new starting lineup today. So, anyways, Jimmy Butler hasn't been traded yet. Now, I just have to get this up on YouTube before he is. Anyways, if you're in the Nashville area, remember, come to Noble's Beer Hall this Thursday night, 7 o'clock. We're going to face Dylan Brooks, Steven Adams, and the Rockets. We're going to give away a lot of prizes to everybody there. Oh, and by the way, congratulations to Jaren Jackson Jr., who was named Western Conference Defensive Player of the Month for December. This is a new award. Defensive Players of the Month have only existed this year, but Wemby won the first one ever in the Western Conference for October and November combined. Jaren wins it for December, so maybe that's a sign that Jaren has entered the Defensive Player of the Year contest. Also, maybe that puts him in consideration for first team all defense. Of course, a great honor for Jaren. It's also a team award. I mean, frankly, the Grizzlies' defense has been great, not counting the last two games. Good defensive numbers. Jaren with great steal and block numbers. Congrats on that award. Anyways, if you want to support my program and get bonus content, do all that at patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. You can join my listener Slack over there. Patreon.com/fastbreakbreakfast. All right. Hope you guys have a great Monday. I'll talk to you soon. Go Grizz!